Labor frontbencher Jason Clare for his thoughts on this story and other matters. Jason Clare, thanks so much for your time. This call for more spending on infrastructure, it comes at quite a good time for governments, I guess, in the sense with rates so low, as Governor Lowe said the other day, they can borrow for years with very low rates. So now is the time to be putting investment into infrastructure in the long term.
Well, how many times during the election campaign did we get told about the government's big plan to bust congestion-busting infrastructure? And what this report shows, Kieran, is that that's all rubbish. It shows that congestion is actually getting worse. It's worse today than it was a couple of years ago, and it's going to get even worse in the future unless the government pulls its finger out and actually starts spending money building the infrastructure that our cities need. The population's going up, and the report shows that the government's not building enough infrastructure, particularly in the outer suburbs, particularly where most Australians live, to actually keep up with the population. And if they don't bring some of that infrastructure spending forward and do it quickly, then the time people spend in their cars on the way to work and on the way to home is just going to get longer and longer in the years ahead.
So the surplus, in your view, needs to be secondary to following this prescription, which is basically borrow more to spend more on infrastructure?
Well, Kieran, I don't think it's one or the other. The government has said the surplus is a priority for them, but they've also said they're estimating a surplus of $7 billion. It takes a long time to get infrastructure, big infrastructure projects off the ground. What they should be doing now is identifying the projects that they can bring forward so that they can actually do what they've promised, which is to reduce congestion and get more people into work, into jobs and fuelling the economy. The economy's weak. Economic growth is the weakest it's been since the global financial crisis. You've got the Reserve Bank having to cut interest rates now down to emergency levels. The Reserve Bank governor couldn't be more clear that something needs to be done here. Now you've got an independent report from Infrastructure Australia saying congestion is going to get worse in the decades ahead unless this government actually does what it promised. One of the biggest broken promises of the last election, I suspect, is going to be all of that rhetoric about congestion busting. Alan Tudge can't open his mouth without talking about congestion busting projects. What this report shows today is that congestion is getting worse, and it's going to get a lot worse in the years ahead unless this government actually does something.
The EU trade negotiations, it looks like food and drink companies will be forced to rename their products under this prospective deal. Is it worth it for the gains with this block of 500 million people? Well,
this is one of the tricky ones. I suspect what we'll see today is that Australian farmers, particularly Australian dairy farmers, will be on edge about this. They'll be worried about, if you can't call feta feta, what do you call it? Bugger if I know. But they'll have to work through all of those difficult issues on that list. Madeleine King, the Shadow Minister for Trade's been out and about talking to dairy farmers about just that. But it's not the only difficult issue. One of the other things I suspect that the Europeans will want is to cut the luxury car tax on things like Ferraris and Lamborghinis. I think it'll be a difficult argument for the government to make to say that we should be making Ferraris and Lamborghinis cheaper at a time where people are just struggling to pay the electricity bill. So there are a lot of complex issues at play here. We want to export more agriculture to Europe, but this is a deal that should be more than just about cows for cars, more beef into Europe and in response to that, Europe being able to export more cars to Australia. And the best way to make sure that it is to have independent economic modelling. The Europeans do that, Kieran. They do an independent assessment of the deal. We should do that too. And here's just another idea. Instead of a deal that just helps business, what about Australian tourists? So when you go on a holiday to Europe, that you don't get charged exorbitant roaming fees for your mobile phone or charges at the ATM.
Sure.
That's a great way to put together a deal that would be supported by the community.
Is it inevitable, though, that some will have to lose in order for the greater gain on this front?
Well, I suspect that some people will lose, and so then the real question is how does the government negotiate an outcome which is acceptable to Australian farmers and beef producers? The devil's always in the detail, and I think this is going to be quite tricky in the months ahead.
OK. Final one on the $500 million commitment over 5 years to the Pacific. This is going to be made by the Prime Minister in Tuvalu at the Pacific Island Forum. Is this a welcome initiative in your view? It certainly is welcome in the eyes of our Pacific neighbours.
Well, I suspect they'll want more than just this. This is money from the existing aid budget. This is an important meeting that's happening over the next few days. We have a special responsibility when it comes to the Pacific. You know, we're the biggest economy in the region. We've got to go out of our way to help our neighbours and our friends in the Pacific. And I welcome what the government has done over the last 12 months or so in terms of extra investment in infrastructure, as well as the announcement that was made recently around waste, plastic waste. I think all of that will be welcomed, but it's pretty clear that what the Pacific leaders want is real action on climate change. And the fact is in Australia that emissions are going up, not down. There seems to be very little evidence that this government is willing to up the ante on what it's willing to do to cut our own emissions. And that's going to be the hardest question that I think the Prime Minister will have to answer at the conference at Tuvalu over the next few days.
Jason Clare, we appreciate your time. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks.